We're talking this evening about one of my favorite subjects, rocks. If I have one lecture to give, perhaps on a college campus, this is usually the one I choose to use because I think it provides the most obvious contrast in the position held by the naturalist and the creationist regarding the world we live in, the rocks, the record of the rocks. We're talking not about rocks in general, but more specifically about sedimentary rocks. And many of you would know that that means rocks laid down by water. And there are rocks laid down by water all over the world, and they're full of billions and billions of dead things. Now, I think Christians ought to know what that sounds like. If you have rocks laid down by water all over the world with billions and billions of dead things, this is exactly what we would predict. But of course, the evolutionist explains it differently. These rocks cover the continents to an average depth of about 1.5 miles, and we have two alternate representations of how that came to be. The evolutionists said it was a slow, gradual buildup over millions of years, recording the process of evolution. We say, no, it was a rapid, high-energy event, a catastrophic flood, and a year-long series of deposition. Now, we want to contrast those two views this evening. The evolutionist represents their model typically this way in the biology and life science textbooks. And this is supposed to represent that gradual, slow development of evolution over millions of years. And if this is the picture you find when you dig down in the earth, we can understand their consideration of the fact that this looks a lot like evolution. The biggest problem with this representation is that you can't dig down in the earth and find it anywhere. You can find it in textbooks, but it's not in the ground. It's not in the rocks. And if that sounds like a brash assertion, let's notice the statement by Leet and Judson, the textbook, geology text, physical geology. Because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all of Earth time neatly in one convenient area, which is what this chart represents. We cannot find that, and because we cannot find that, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. So some of it may be in Tennessee, some of it may be in California, some of it may be in China, but it's stacked together, pieced together from locality to locality. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. So it is co-related from all over the world, not in one place, digging down and finding this. Well, how do you know which layer goes on the bottom and which one goes on the top? Well, of course, if you're an evolutionist, you know the simple animals go on the bottom. Right? More complex would go on the top. But then to turn around and use that as proof is obvious circular logic, because you use the assumption to prove or to construct the model. But let's emphasize, as asserted here in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. This is not concrete, if you please. This is not what you find when you dig down. This is a mental abstraction that comes as a result of correlating rocks from all over the world. Now, the process, I think, is illustrated clearly by R.H. Rastell as he acknowledges that it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle here in the Encyclopedia Britannica. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, I think you can see the problem logically with that, but let's illustrate it this way. A person says we have a primitive fossil. Okay, how do you know that that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's got an old rock in it. Okay, that makes sense. I understand that. But how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And round we go, and it's not asserting anything in terms of proof. This is useless, but it's often used as proof. It's an illustration of the assumption. But while we don't find it all conveniently in one area, isn't it true, we're told, that there are evolutionary progressions that we can see in the rocks that would be represented by the column, and that's just a misrepresentation. David Repp is not going to overemphasize the problems. He's curator of the largest fossil museum in the United States, Chicago Field Museum. He says in New Scientist, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions, which is what this column is supposed to represent. In general, these have not been found, and yet optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. And so, in his words, this is what we're looking at. If we're looking at this as a complete picture of something you dig down in the earth and find, that's fantasy, it's not true. Besides, that excuses a lot of the reality of geology. Most of what you're looking at here involve vertebrates, animals with backbones. They leave the impression that things have really developed. And that's a very skewed picture in view of the fact that over 95% of all the fossils are marine invertebrates, animals without backbones. And of the 5% that's left, 4.5% are plants and algae. Actually, the vertebrates, which are almost all of that column, are less than 1/100th of 1%. And of that 1/100th of 1%, most of that's fish. But that's not what you're seeing in the column, is it? So you see they have represented there what's almost not in the fossil record. And why would they skew it in that direction, away from the marine invertebrates? Well, if you represented it that way, you might get the impression we're looking at a flood deposit, which I believe is exactly what we're looking at, and I think we can demonstrate. All of the founders of the discipline of geology believed this. Nicholas Steno is generally called the father of modern stratigraphy, the study of the strata. He's described by Batten in a representative geology textbook, Evolution of the Earth, saying Steno's axioms, and he had 12 rules of interpreting the strata that you have to memorize. If you don't know his axioms, you're not going to pass stratigraphy. This is the way you do it. Steno's axioms provide the ultimate basis of practically all interpretation of Earth history, and so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. This is very important. It is the way you do it. But what they don't tell you is that he came up with these 12 axioms and his concepts of geology in the context of flood geology, and believed that all of these layers were laid down by a catastrophic flood, and understood it well enough to write the rules that we still have to learn today if we're going to interpret the strata. I was doing work at Cambridge in England, and there in the Trinity Library was one of the first editions translated. The first one was in Latin, this one is in English. Under glass in the library there, and in the dedication page it said, dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. Now that tells you where he's coming, but now if you study stratigraphy, here's the father of modern stratigraphy, here's the rules you have to memorize, and you won't hear a word about this concept. And I've had many professors just argue with me. Well, he never believed that. He couldn't be a flood geologist. But that obviously is not true. That was his concept. And his concepts, as we pointed out, are the basis of the interpretation of Earth history today. In fact, in geology, for the first time I've seen it in print in the U.S., back in 2006, they acknowledged Steno believed in a universal flood throughout his life. This is the way the discipline of geology began. Building on that, very important book was published about 1961 by Whitcomb and Morris, interpreting the geology of the earth in terms of the concepts that Steno had laid down, together with what we have learned since then. We've learned more since 61, and that's been updated. But it's interesting to look at the foreword to this book written by a thoroughgoing evolutionist, head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, but a gentleman and one who fairly looked at what they were saying. Many will say, well, a flood would just jumble everything together and wouldn't leave the layers and the segregated groups. And that's not the case at all, as seen from Steno's interpretation. He acknowledged that the facts of geology do fit this interpretation in the preface, and that they had built a strong case for this interpretation and a serious challenge to the evolutionary interpretation. Now, he didn't say their view fits, my view doesn't, but I would. I think that is a summary and can certainly be seen implied from what he said. Updating that is a more recent book that I would highly recommend, John Morris's The Global Flood, the son of Henry Morris, and brings it up to date with what we know about it now. As we think about the flood as a general interpretation for the sedimentary rocks, there are a number of objections that come to mind, people that perhaps haven't thought along these lines. One of the first questions we get is, where did the water come from? Where do you get enough water to cover the mountains? Well, we have plenty of water. Note the statement by Jacques Cousteau, who's considered one of the leading authorities in oceanography. He says, were all the crust of the earth to be leveled, evened out, no land at all would show above the surface of the sea. The earth would be covered by a uniform sheet of water more than 10,000 feet deep. So about 2 miles of water we have in the oceans now, enough to cover the earth if it's like a ball bearing, if it's smooth. And I think it started out with considerably less relief than we have now. Well, okay, you would have 2 miles of water, you got enough water to cover the earth, but where did it go? You can't just make it disappear. And I think we can learn that from Scripture, not that we're proving the point in this context. We're using this as a model to see if it fits what we do see. I think we can, but that's another approach. Psalm 104 says, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. Okay, he's talking here about the flood. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, and the valleys, or literally basins, sank down. Now, as we crudely illustrate that, to try to communicate the idea, perhaps this is what we're looking at before the flood, with waters above the firmament described in Genesis 1, 6, and 7. 1 mile high mountains, 1 mile deep oceans, proposed as a model. Would this fit? Well, if those waters were precipitated, if they came down, there would be enough water to cover the mountains, even with 1 mile deep oceans and 1 mile high mountains. Not a mile above the mountains, but certainly above the mountains. So the waters were standing above the mountains. Then the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. So now then it's pushed up and the oceans sank down, so that now over 70% of the earth's surface we have 3 mile deep oceans instead of 1 mile deep oceans. That's where the water went, and it has certainly a tremendous capacity. when you have an extra 2 miles of depth over 70% of the Earth's surface. So I think we can explain where it came from and where it went. That fits perfectly. But then the next question we get is, well, how do you get the groups segregated in this mishmash of a flood? Well, water is a very effective sorting agent. You just walk along the beach and you can see sorting very easily. But we forget often that we do not have everything a hodgepodge of plants and animals. You have it segregated by natural habitat. And if you're going up and down the Grand Canyon, you see down at the bottom of the canyon certain plants and animals. You go about halfway up and you see totally different plants and animals. And you go still further up and still different plants and animals. And that kind of segregation of ecology is preserved by the flood. It would bury organisms where they lived, similar to the diagram we have here. Of course, the diagram here is all in one spot, and it would not be in one spot, but we use it for illustration. The groups were buried separately because they lived separately. Not all the animals that lived at the bottom of the ocean lived with the ones on the plains. They lived in different places, separated not because they were segregated by millions of years, but because of natural habitats. And so when we see the flood deposit today, we see the ecological zones that existed at the time of the flood preserved, not separated by millions of years, but by ecology that existed at the time of the flood. And so, summarizing then, this representation, based certainly in the detailed form on circular logic, is that which is arranged and skewed in favor of the vertebrates. It's a conceptual correlation that is useless as proof of evolution. And yet, many, many people look at that and say, well, it looks like evolution, so that must be true. Well, when you look at all of the facts, you see that's not very good proof at all. But it can be useful as a model. With a model, you do begin with the assumption and then proceed to see if the facts fit. And so we can use this as an illustration of the concept of evolution, what would be expected if evolution were true, and does this fit the facts? Can you test it? Well, circular logic is sometimes hard to break into, but there is a test that was proposed by S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins that would, I think, make sense to most. He referred to topsy-turvy fossils in terms of the order in the column. He said that would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence would force us to rethink our theory. And he's talking about animals that are supposed to be at the top, at the bottom, or vice versa. And if they're obviously opposite to where they're supposed to be, then you've got a refutation of this idea that's represented by the column. But this kind of thing is not uncommon. You find lots of animals that live down at the bottom of, represented at the bottom here of this column, that are still alive today. Niles Eldredge, curator of the American Museum of Natural History, wrote a book called Living Fossils, and that's really his subject, animals that were living a long time ago, but they're still alive today. He said there seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare. We've not completely solved the riddle of living fossils. And he gives literally hundreds of examples in his book. We'll look at two quickly. He's the president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, and he refers to the horseshoe crab, which first appeared some 424 million years ago in the Silurian. Well, I don't buy those ages again, but I think we talked about that last night. But let's play the game their way, see if this is consistent with what they're saying. Wait a minute. They appeared 424 million years ago, and they look the same as the ones we're looking at today, and they're all over the place today. Why didn't they evolve? Well, that's the embarrassment that he's talking about. We haven't explained that. The last fossils became extinct about 50 million years ago. Yeah, fossils don't become extinct. I'm a little embarrassed for him there, but, well, not much. But the point is, he's saying, according to this geologic column, they disappeared 50 million years ago, and we hadn't had any for 50 million years, but they're running around in the ocean all over the place. Now, that doesn't fit the picture, does it? The coelacanth is another example that he gives in his book, Living Fossil. This is, as he said, a fish thought to be extinct for 70 million years. A coelacanth concurrently with the dinosaurs, and it looks quite like, what? Like modern forms that are out running around in the ocean today. And we have no fossil coelacanths younger than the late Cretaceous. In other words, they went extinct, according to the column, at the same time as the dinosaurs. We've had none since then, but they're running around all over the place. We've caught over 1,000 of them since they were discovered back in the 30s. This is exactly what is proposed as a refutation, a test. This is what we'll call a topsy fossil, supposed to be at the bottom, found at the top. And one of the most obvious implications of finding this is that it falsifies the extinction hypothesis. The idea that you go so far and then they stop, no more in the column, they're extinct, is falsified, because over 100 times in his book he shows examples where that was not the case. But the real test in the mind of the evolutionist is the opposite test. Things supposed to be at the top that are found at the bottom. We'll call those the turvy fossils. And the logic is obvious. How could they possibly be down at the bottom if they hadn't evolved yet? That's not going to work at all. That would rip it. Richard Dawkins acknowledges this in The Blind Watchmaker. He said, we should be very surprised, for example, to find fossil humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to have evolved. That's that turvy fossil. Our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. He's got his chin out here. This is obviously a test of the idea. If our evolution could be so easily disproved if just a single fossil turned up in the wrong date order. He says, what would be evidence against evolution, and very strong evidence of that, would be the discovery of a single fossil in the wrong geological stratum. It's there before it's supposed to have evolved. This is a problem. Well, it sounds like he's being fair and objective and saying, all right, here's a test, and this is the way you do science. If this happens, it's verified. This happens, it's falsified. Except that when you do it that way, he doesn't play fair. We found exactly what he's talking about. For example, near LaSalle, Utah, just below Moab, we found now 11 human skeletons in the same formation with the dinosaurs that are supposed to be 100 million years removed from humans. Humans hadn't evolved yet at the time of the dinosaurs, according to that column. Well, that's exactly what he called for, but this must be an intrusional burial. They must have fallen down a crack. They must have crawled back in a cave, and the cave collapsed on them. And of course, there's no indication of that at all. This is the same formation that we find in Dinosaur National Monument, one of the formations there. There are 4 females, 1 infant, no tools, no broken bones. That doesn't sound like a mine cave-in, does it? With a lot of females, an infant, no tools, and no broken bones. There's no indication of a crack anywhere. They're just washed into place. We went back to that site. It's an open pit copper mine at this point. They were found 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone, supposed to be 140 million years old. And here is one example. This one is the only one that is articulated, that is together as in life. The hip is in the lower right-hand corner. and then the knee up top and the foot over on the left. The bones are replaced with malachite. They're green. These are just washed into place. They may look like they're together, but they're not. They're just, these are the fellows that missed the boat. They washed into place. I had just taken this bone out, washed it off with the canteen, and it's a bright green. They're perfectly modern bones that are in the same layer with the dinosaurs. Replaced with malachite, no collagen whatsoever, which would indicate they're certainly not recent burials, at least 1,000 years typically, for the collagen to disappear. So here is a perfect Turvey fossil that Dawkins says would utterly destroy evolution. It would disprove it, but you can erode, redeposit, you can have bones fall down cracks. It's possible. You need some indication of it, but there's none here. He goes on in this article, or in the Blind Watchmaker we're talking about, saying, ironically, it's also the reason why evolutionists were so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. Well, he's not been there, but he knows this is significant because footprints can't be intrusionally buried, can it? Really better evidence than the bones, because you can't erode them and redeposit them. They are where they are. And he's referring to the footprints down at Dinosaur Valley State Park in Texas, where the Paluxy River erodes down and reveals some really spectacular tracks. Discovered in the early 40s, and they're just some of the best dinosaur tracks in the world. Some of them are unusual. Here we see one that's raised three-dimensionally upward. How does that happen? Well, normally tracks are depressed, aren't they? This one is raised. What happens is that you have the depressed track and then other material washes over and fills in and then becomes harder with slightly different chemicals, and then with subsequent erosion, the matrix erodes away and leaves that harder infill in the center, slightly raised. Now that's important for what we'll be looking at again later this evening. But this is the raised infill. In addition to tracks, very detailed dinosaur tracks that you can see there, you also see tracks that look like that. And what in the world could that be? Anybody figure that out? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, but this is the one that Dawkins was sure was carved from behind his desk at Oxford. He could tell that. We found a number of others. We looked around for some that weren't quite so good. I was somewhat intimidated by his carving charge. It did look pretty good. Stan Taylor decided to test this idea that they were carved. Finding two coming out of the riverbank, he decided to go back up under the riverbank. Here's about 6 feet of alternating clay, limestone. And if that trail continued back up under the overburden, what would that say about the carved idea? That'd pretty well refute it, wouldn't it? It continued for a sequence of 12 tracks. We've extended it now to 14. Looking at some of them, you see clear mud push-up around it, which is not what erosion does. This is pressure from the original footprint. The one that really impressed and persuaded me was this one, and you have to look at it a minute to get the details, because you've got two tracks put together. Here is the dinosaur track, about 25 inches, and that's pretty consistent on this platform. But look what stepped in the middle of it. Supposed to be 100 million years apart, but they're stepping in each other's footprints. All 5 toes and instep and heel are pretty obvious. And we presented this in a science meeting up in Tennessee, and the fellow who had gotten Humanist of the Year that year for explaining these away, saying they're just dinosaur tracks, was furious. And he got on the plane the next morning and was in the river with an iron bar, and when he finished, that track looked like this. And we have some people react to evidence that way. But of course, we had good stereo photographs and casts. It's well documented. I don't think he helped himself at all. Look a little further up the trail, we see another one. This one shows the three-toed dinosaur track that's almost flush. It really didn't show up initially, but with further erosion did. But the depression is very human-like. Looking at a side view of that same depression, we see the three toes almost flush of the dinosaur, but the human footprint just fits in it, and when you put your foot in it and it feels molded, it's very persuasive. One of the ways to test the idea is you do find lots of funny looking things in rocks that just happen to look like something. But one of the ways to test would be with a sequence showing right, left, right, left. That's not typically the way you find erosion. This one is a right, and directly ahead of it is a left, and you see that sequence continuing for 14. Looking at this one from the side, you can see it's completely outside the dinosaur track. Sometimes they're within, sometimes across, sometimes completely outside, but together with the dinosaur tracks. The whole platform has 134 dinosaur tracks on it. We've highlighted the ones going across the human trail of now 14 tracks, in even from this picture, a right, left pattern. Analyzing it like this, we see that each of them have at least a general human shape, 14 tracks. They're pretty consistent in length. We showed you, of course, the best ones with the toes. Miraliki's tracks over in Africa don't have toes. Well, you can see the great toe sometimes, but not the individual toes. That's pretty unusual. But we've got 7 with clear toes. We've got tracks that you can distinguish right, left in 12 of the 14. And we did a double-blind test at Kansas State University in the psych department with life-size pictures of these tracks just laid out on the table. First question, what are they? And the psych students, without knowing anything about this ahead of time, said, well, it looks like human footprints. And then we got rough on them. Tell me right from left. And 87% of the response was exactly what we predicted. 2 of them you can't tell, and so that variance is exactly as predicted. But none of them were consistently different from what they ought to be. 14 out of 14. So this is the way you do science. And I think this provides just powerful evidence that answers the objections. They are the perfect Turvey fossils. They can't be intrusional because they were excavated from under the well, you can't do that with footprints. You can't intrusionally move and bury footprints. They're not carved because they were under the overburden. They're not erosion. You got right, left, right, left, right, left. How do you know it's not? You see sometimes old man in the mountain, it kind of erodes to look like the profile of a man. But if you look up there and you see 4 old men in the mountain that look like presidents, you got a pretty good idea that's not erosion, don't you? 14 in a right-left pattern is not erosion. And I like to present this on the college campuses. We presented it at University of Tennessee to about 50 grad students who then turned around to the head of the department when it was over. What are you going to say about this? What do you have to respond with? And he said, well, we don't know that there weren't dinosaurs back there with human feet. Now that's what he said. And I thought a minute. I said, well, I guess that's right. We don't know that. We also don't know that there weren't humans back there with dinosaur feet. Wouldn't that make about as much sense? Wouldn't it make more sense to think these things look like dinosaur feet were made by dinosaurs? These things look like human feet made by humans. No, he wouldn't agree with that. I said, well, if they were human, would they look any different? And he got mad. He left. But that's the best he could do. Dinosaurs with human feet. Chuck Finsley, who was curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History, came down. He wanted to display one of our dinosaurs. We made him look at the footprints. He got mad and left. He really wanted to display that dinosaur, so he came back, and then the third time, he finally said, Dr. Patton, I have the answer. I can tell you exactly why we're seeing these footprints that look like humans down here. He says, I think they were made by aliens. And he's very serious. I said, well, Chuck, if they're made by aliens, wouldn't they come from a galaxy far, far away and obviously be more intelligent than we are? What are they doing running around barefooted? He got mad. But it's it's just fun to be a creationist to say, maybe it's what it looks like. Just go with the evidence. No, dinosaurs with human feet and aliens work better. Or maybe it was alien dinosaurs with human feet. I don't know. It's an example of the ugly stepsister making sure that foot fits even when it doesn't. I think it's time to have fun and just go with the evidence. All right, we're going to stop at this point and see if some of you have some questions. Yes, sir.
You said that one of the sites where you found the human bones was in Utah. So humans making it all the way over to North America before the flood? Is that...
I suspect that there was one continent before the flood, that the split came during the flood. Now, I spent about 10 minutes this evening earlier explaining that, and it would take a while. I'd be glad to elaborate on that, but I think there's real good evidence. Genesis doesn't say the land, it does say that when he separated the land from the waters, that he brought the waters together into one place. Well, that doesn't necessarily infer land in one place, but it kind of sounds like it. It would point to that as the beginning circumstance. The idea of plate tectonics is a creationist idea. It came from Wagner, who proposed it in the 20s. They laughed him off the intellectual stage because he was a creationist, but then by the 60s and 70s, enough evidence accumulated that they were buying it, except they couldn't make it work. The geophysicists were providing unanswerable and still have unanswerable questions. I think we can make it work. And John Baumgartner is a geophysicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's done a three-dimensional computer model demonstrating how this works. It takes a Cray computer about 2 weeks to run the program, but most of the universities in the country now are using his program. It will not work slow as they use it. They have to throw out the friction coefficient to make it work. But if you do it quickly, melting the interface overcomes the friction and it works just fine. So he's using all of the data, doing it quickly during the flood, and it works fine. They take his model and throw out the friction coefficient and pretend it's not a problem. Now that normally takes me 30 minutes to say, but that's a quick rendition. But yeah, I think it was all one, and that would not have been a problem. Another solution to that kind of argument that we would hear, especially after the flood, is that we were circumnavigating the globe long before Columbus. The idea that he started that is really silly in history. We've got maps that were in the Library of Alexandria 300 years before Christ that show all 5 continents. How do they do that? Well, they'd have to know spherical trigonometry to map the continent, and then they'd have to be there. Antarctica is shown clearly in the Piraeus map. This is documented by Charles Hapgood of the University of New Hampshire in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, forward by Albert Einstein. Well documented. It's not, they just don't like to tell you about it. But that would, if they circumnavigated the globe, it could be all over the place. long before the time of Christ. And when Jesus told them to go to the uttermost parts of the earth, do you think they did that? Think about it. Okay. Questions? Got time for one more question before somebody's pointing over here. Yes.
Well, this is not completely related to what we've been talking about, but you think that there will come a time where evolution will not be held so tightly to as a theory for origin?
Well, I'm not a prophet. We can see certainly Darwinism, what's referred to today as neo-Darwinism, crumbling. And we'll document that tomorrow evening. That doesn't mean that creation will win by default. Transpermia comes from outer space, different ideas. Some of the Near Eastern ideas are really far out. Basically, the only alternative to creation is some form of natural evolving. So I guess it would probably be some form, but not neo-Darwinism. I don't think that's going to last much longer. What's going to replace it, maybe we'll have something to do with that. We got work to do. Okay, thank you for your attention. Let's take a quick break and be back in about 5 minutes. As we pointed out in the previous lecture, we are having lots of fun, just following the evidence. We presented this at several science meetings, and probably the most common response we got was, well, you need more evidence. 14 in a right-left pattern in the middle of 134 dinosaur tracks is a lot of evidence. But we decided to proceed, and as in fact, the drought cooperated with us about that time, and we continued to pump the river dry. You can see the sandbags. A lot of effort went into making this picture, but we proceeded and excavated that dinosaur trail back to the south, and over 500 consecutive feet of dinosaur tracks. The longest consecutive dinosaur trail on the American continent. And the little man that you see at the end of the arrow, maybe you can see, is not at the end of the trail. He's pointing around the corner to the end of the trail. And the tracks in that trail are some of, if not the best in the world. So it's the longest and the bestest of tracks anywhere on the American continent. Possibly some down in Turkmenistan that would rival this. It's called, the human trail is called the Taylor Trail. It was first excavated by Stan Taylor that we looked at earlier. But this provides excellent evidence. But you need more evidence. Okay, this platform ahead of the fella may have dinosaur tracks on it. It's got several layers above that print layer, and so we removed those layers and got down to the print layer, and sure enough, there were the dinosaur tracks again, over 100 dinosaur tracks, and right through the middle of it is a 15-track sequence, of very human-looking tracks. Looking at the middle of it here, we see two clear dinosaur tracks, different type dinosaur. This is the duckbill type, duck-shaped foot, and they're slightly raised, especially the one on the left, as we indicated earlier, with that hardened infill, more resistant to erosion, providing a raised track. But then look what stepped in the right one. Wow, that's dramatically human shaped. Looking at a close-up of that one on the right, we can see that slightly raised dinosaur track that is a mate to the one on the left. But here is another shape in the back of it, surrounded by the mud push-up. All 5 toes, even see knuckles in some of the toes. That's just awesome. Tremendous detail in a sequence of 15 in a right-left pattern. Not all of them that clear, but many of them very clear. And you know, they quit asking for more evidence. We did go back to the Burdick track, which was discovered in the 40s by Clifford Burdick, and we weren't sure where it came from. We did a lot of investigation, finally found the exact spot that it did come from, and it was not from the Paluxy River, but a tributary, and just less than a mile away, but in the certainly the same geologic stratum. But this was carved according to Dawkins. Well, how do you know? Sometimes you can section across the track and see formations immediately under the track that would tell you. Here at the heel where we sectioned, you can see disturbed material directly under the heel. Now, carving would cut across any formations, whereas when you have pressure indications directly under the heel, this certainly looks real and that it was not carved. We presented this at a science meeting down at College Station. And they said, well, obviously this is a real dinosaur track, but it must be a dinosaur track somebody carved toes on. So we sectioned across the toes, which is a real reach because sometimes you don't have anything even under the dinosaur track. Going for toes of a human track that has to be really good stuff. And you do have very fine-grained limestone here. And sure enough, right at the toes, you have indications all across there, the great toe especially, following contours. You see formations, typical load-bearing structures that you find actually better here than you find in most engineering textbooks that describe this. But at the great toe, I think anyone can see those following contours that would not be the case if it were carved. And so, yes, we verified that both at heel and toe, and we didn't hear much anymore, but then it got better when in 2000 this was found. Wow, now that one is too good to be true. A human track and a dinosaur track, just really clear. Well, that has to be carved, we were told. And we certainly considered the possibility, but we could eliminate that by a CAT scan that would slice across, actually hundreds of times across this virtually, and see what was in the interior. And some of the slices were very revealing. This one particularly, you can see the dinosaur toe corresponding to the white line down below it, and then the human toe would be where we are pointing and the white line would cross it there. But the contours, the following contours under that human toe clearly show this is not the carving that would cut across, but we see the following contours. So this is verified by a virtual slice and the CAT scan. So again, they haven't asked for more evidence now. Travel with me to the Natural Bridges National Monument in the Four Corners area near Blanding, Utah. The Anasazi Indians lived here and then disappeared about 1,200 years ago, mysteriously, and left a lot of the petroglyphs, carvings, especially under some of these arches where they've been protected. And Dr. Swift is pointing, maybe you can see, up to an area under these arches where there's a lot of drawings. We see the Anasazi petroglyphs, the medicine men and the snakes. And then if you look closely, I'll highlight the drawing right beside me there. It's covered with the desert varnish, which makes it very difficult to photograph. It also testifies to its antiquity. It takes probably at least 1,000 years for that to form. But that's pretty obvious. And what were the Indians doing drawing dinosaurs over 1,000 years ago? They had to be seeing them. We travel down to Peru, and lots of very interesting things down there. Dr. Javier Cabrera was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine at the University of Lima, retired to be cultural anthropologist of Inca, Peru. His father had been collecting burial stones from the Inca tombs since the 30s, and he continued. They're ancestors of the conquistadors. He has a big castle there on the town square in Inca, and about 11,000 of these burial stones he's collected. And here we're looking at one in place in the tomb that were found buried with the Incas. Why? Well, we're not sure, but there's some strange scenes. About a third of them are some of the most disgusting pornography that I hope you've never seen. But also with these Inca burial stones are pictures of dinosaurs. These go back about 1,500 to 2,500 years from the Inca culture. This one in particular is interesting because it has the dermal frills on the back. When Mr. Sinclair drew his dinosaur, he didn't know about that. But they knew about it 2,500 years ago, and it was first published in Geology in 1990. But there are hundreds of these, thousands of these actually, looking at some of the larger ones, a variety of sizes. Here you see in the upper right-hand corner the dinosaur with a man foot in his mouth, shades of Jurassic Park. Again, different types of stone, different styles, different species, a wild collection, and different styles of art. Sometimes bias relief, sometimes just simple carvings. These were excavated in 2006. Some had said Cabrera carved all of these 11,000 stones. He performed the first heart transplant in Peru, established the first teaching hospital, was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine. So what's he doing carving 11,000 stones? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. He did die in 2002, and we're continuing to excavate these from the tombs there. The grave cloths wrapping the mummies also show the dinosaur motif. See clear indications there. Their pottery, likewise, shows dinosaurs here in the Moche stirrup vessels. This one is in the National Museum in Lima, and it says circa 2,500 years. That's an excellent Turvey fossil, exactly what he's calling for. Up in northern Peru, you see the gold death masks, and on either side of the face, the beast with the dermal frills across the back and the tail curled up over it and the huge teeth on either side. It would appear these people were seeing dinosaurs, and that's clearly indicated in the Turvey fossils down in Peru. We traveled to Mexico in the Central Highlands in Acambaro. Dr. Swift and I have made a number of trips there over a period of about 5 years, and there's some very interesting ceramic figurines in a collection, over 30,000 of them, the Chapiquaro culture, dated at about 4,000 years ago. But in addition to the rather bizarre creatures, you see some that look like this. There are about 2,000 in the collection that are obviously dinosaurs from 4,000 years ago, which would certainly be an excellent Turvey fossil. Some of them are standing up. We learned that about 15 years ago from the book Dinosaur Heresies by Bacher. Of course, Spielberg taught us all. They stood up. They knew it 4,000 years ago down in Mexico. a variety. Some of them are very artistic. Some of them are almost cartoonish. Some of them pretty literal, and I don't think there's any doubt what they're looking at. This one is my wife's favorite. Of course, you don't have to have the human connected with it to know that there was a human doing this, but the obvious conclusion would be that dinosaur and man lived together. If they're all created in 6 days, where's the problem? If they're 100 million years apart, yeah, there's a big problem, isn't there? We travel to France. Now, Zenda doesn't go with me down to central Mexico or to some of the other places, but we go to France, fly into Paris. She's, yep, I'm ready. Standing here in front of the Louvre, photographing me here in front of this carving from the 1500s of Sir George fighting the dragon, and looking closely at the, quote, dragon, he looks a whole lot like a T-Rex, doesn't he? Why don't we have dragons in the Bible? A question we get all the time. Well, the word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841 by Robert Owen, who was a creationist, by the way, whereas the King James was translated in 1611. There was no word. So you read about dragons all the way through the Bible, and I know what they look like. We know Sir George slaying the dragon. This is a picture from Germany, and they're all over Europe. I know what those things look like. We travel to France down to Chateau de Chambord. This one has over 700 dinosaurs carved on it. This is Zenda standing beside one of them, and you see the scales, maybe even breathing fire here. That's something we're not sure about. But the claws and the tail, the long neck, this certainly fits. Some have suggested maybe it's a salamander. If you want to go that route, I guess you can. It doesn't look like of course, they don't have scales and don't have a long neck. All over this thing, ceilings covered with dinosaurs. It was supposed to have been a hunting lodge. It kind of makes you wonder what they're hunting, doesn't it? This was one of the ceiling tiles. Compare that with the Harvard Museum of Natural History rendition of Plateosaurus. We think of maybe 1 or 2 different dinosaurs we're familiar with. There were maybe 50. Plateosaurus was one that seems to match this creature perfectly. This one is over the fireplace, but he sure looks a lot like the Harvard Museum Plateosaurus. About 20 kilometers away at Chateau de Bois, a still older castle, goes back to the 12th century. You have dinosaurs all over it, just covered with dinosaurs. In the throne room, there is a tapestry that goes back to the 1200s. And looking closely at that tapestry, here's a dragon dinosaur type. It's amazing that many dinosaurs look very dragon-like. This is Dracorex haworthia. Some of you recognize Harry Potter's dragon. Bob Barker, the discoverer here. Looking closely then at the head of what's on the tapestry and comparing it with Dracorex haworthia, wow, that's a match. And we see that all over Europe. Here in 2 places very clearly, dinosaurs and man obviously associated. We travel to Cambodia. Up in the upper section near Siem Reap, we see some of the most beautiful temples ever built and some of the largest. Amazing architecture. One of the major builders was Jayavarman VII. He began to reign in 1181, and his picture is there on the right that I took in the museum there at Phnom Penh, posed almost Buddha-like, showing the reverence for him. He built this temple for his mother-in-law, and we know the exact date, 1186. It was a Buddhist combination, Buddhist-Hindu. He was a politician. He put them together. But right up here in the corner on stones totally covered with stone carvings. You see the Hindu dancing girls, and you see monkeys and parrots, jungle animals, and what's down here at the right on the bottom, looking at a close-up, what does that look like to you? You ask most 12-year-olds, and they'll tell you immediately, we're looking at a Stegosaurus. Well, how did they do that? I don't think they had one posing for them, but they probably saw one somewhere in order to be able to do that perfectly. We tested the idea of what would an artist do from memory by running an experiment at the University of Texas at Arlington with the art department. We assigned a freshman artist in the art department there the task, draw us a Stegosaurus from memory without looking at the internet or the books. This one looks better than every one they did. They didn't do so good. But you can test that proposition. This obviously shows man and dinosaur lived together. And the implications of that are devastating for those who are trying to say they're 100 million years apart. Some of the leading evolutionists, and we have the full rendition of their quotes in the handout, have acknowledged this. Louis Jacobs of SMU, president at the time of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, says evolution would be vanquished if evolution, that is, if humans were shown to live contemporaneously. Stephen Stanley, as we quoted earlier, said it would disprove evolution. Jerry Cohn of the University of Chicago says it would be one of the ugly facts that would kill Darwinism if you document humans and dinosaurs together. Dawkins has railed against it. He says evolution would be utterly destroyed. Evolution would be disproved. It would blow the theory of evolution out of the water. Well, I think they're all right. I think that's the implication, and you'll have to decide whether or not we've done that. I think we have, with good evidence. This column, which is used so often as proof of evolution, we've shown is not proof at all, but a model to be tested. And when we test it and compare it with the real world, we find contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. And when a model is contradicted that often and that consistently, it's time for it to go. That does not represent what you see in the real world. We did have people who were very excited about the idea that came down to Glen Rose to photograph the footprints of humans and dinosaurs. They understood the significance and were excited about it. Nova was there. However, when they made the film, the editor killed it and replaced it with a documentary on Jerry Swaggart. He would not allow it. He did put out a small video, a short video, in which he said there is nothing at Glen Rose that looks anything like a human footprint. And then referred to dinosaurs side by side with humans. Of course, denying that it was there. You saw the evidence yourself. You can decide whether there's something that looked like a human footprint there. I think obviously there is. But if there was, he said finding them would counter evidence that humans evolved long after the dinosaurs became extinct and back up the claim that all species, including man, were created at one time. He understands the implications, and that's why he's fighting it and will not allow it. If that's what we're seeing, then that's what it means. And you just decide if we've done that, looking at the evidence yourself. All right, let's see if some of you have some questions. Yes, sir.
So if they were living together, then there would be hundreds, thousands of other examples of footprints or artifacts or bones. I mean, how many other examples are out there that show the coexistence?
Well, there are quite a few, and we have to edit. This could have been a lot longer, but there is abundant evidence. How much evidence do you see in Israel today of lions? I haven't seen any, and we've spent a good bit of time over there. You probably could somewhere, but I've just not seen that. It disappears when they disappear. We had hundreds of millions of buffalo out west when the white man arrived, and you see some indications, but most of 99% of all that's gone, and there's very little indication today of what was there then. And most, they would have all been gone if we hadn't stepped in and really put forth some heroic efforts to save the buffalo. But as Dawkins indicated, you get one fossil out of place, that's enough to blow it up. And we've got a whole lot more than one, and then a whole lot more than what we've showed. There's an excellent book called Dire Dragons, written by Vance Nelson, which shows page after page after page of examples of what we've shown you tonight. And I would highly recommend that. Other questions? Yes.
Okay, I'm kind of confused by the tapestries that you showed in 15th century, 14th century, 11th century. So are you saying that there were dinosaurs in that century, in those centuries?
Had to be. How did they draw pictures? Very accurately. Lots of histories mention them. In fact, almost all of them, but often they mention them as dragons. But what does a dragon look like? There was no word for dinosaur, and so it was dragon that was being used, and that's all the way through the Bible. Praise him, ye dragons. Well, I think that's the point that was being made to Job when he's shown Behemoth. Look at Behemoth, whom I made with you. Look at Leviathan. His face guarded round about with teeth, scales close sealed together, laughs at the javelin and the spear. When he riseth up, the whole earth is afraid, the king of God's creation. Some say it was a hippopotamus. It doesn't sound like a hippopotamus to me. His tail like a giant cedar. Hippopotamus has got this little tail at the back. No, that's not what that is. This is something that does praise God, and that's the point. Job, you're complaining about God and saying he's not treating you right, and you're bitter. You look at these wonders of creation. Look at the Leviathan, the big T-Rex here that is king of all creation. You want to go argue with him? I don't think so. But argue with his creator, does that make more sense? No, he's awesome. And when, of course, I have a T-Rex skull in my museum down in Arkansas. And the skull is probably longer front to back than this communion table. Just huge. And the kids come in and look at that, and the big teeth and jaws drop, and wow. And my wife and I will sit around sometimes and count, how many wows are we going to get? And there's about half a dozen each time. But the point that I make is there's a bigger wow than that. And that's the one that designed him. And I think the dragons do praise God. That's what we sing about. Yes?
I'm sure you've received this question before, but how do you respond to the argument of, well, how did Noah get all these dinosaurs onto the ark and survive the flood?
It's real simple. God caused them to come. That's what he said. You wouldn't have had to have had Seismosaurus, which I think is the great-grandpa. Now, we'll be talking about that briefly Friday night. Reptiles continue to grow all their life, unlike mammals. Our bones ossify when we mature, we don't grow anymore. They continue to grow and probably lived longer before the flood. And if they did, that would account for some of the Seismosaurus-type dinosaurs. But you wouldn't want the great-grandpas on the ark to reproduce. You'd want the teenagers or smaller. Juvenile forms would work fine. So they may have been the size, well, actually the average size dinosaur, what would you think? Just published in PLOS, the average size is about the size of the American bison. There are many more chicken-sized, smaller dinosaurs than many people realize, but the average is about, so if you got 50 pairs of bison, you got plenty of room. Yes?
I know we've been asking this every night, but what do the skeptics say to the humans and dinosaurs together? Are they just turning their head pretty much to that?
You get a wide variety, and it's not unusual to have them look at that and just say, I've been wrong, and just turn around. And we've seen that happen just in a few nights of discussion with them. We had 3 geologists up at the University of Central Arkansas. We had a good-sized auditorium, about 600 people, and there were 3 geologists that were pretty militant the first night, opposing. And then the second night, they were still asking questions, but it was more information type. And the third night, they weren't saying anything. They were just listening. The fourth night, the one that was probably the leader came up to me and said, well, we've checked all of your references. We looked up every one of these quotes to make sure you weren't taking it out of context, and you're not. He said, it's obvious you're right. We were wrong. He said, we need to start over, and we've all decided to do that. What book should we read? Now, when that happens on a regular basis, it's certainly not discouraging, but it's somewhat similar to preaching the truth on salvation to denominational preachers that have been preaching something different all their life. It's not what you have happen all the time, but it does happen, and it should happen more often in science, where you're trained to think reasonably. That doesn't mean you will. There's still ambition and concern for reputation that greatly hinders, but we see that happening. We had a presentation that we made at Missouri State University just a few weeks ago, and there were 2 geneticists there each night that got totally turned around and were just thrilled and excited by the time it was over, and thanking us for making them so much better professors at this point. So that happens. Others yell and scream and cuss and lie. People are different. Texas A&M at College Station, there was one of the professors that was just cussing a blue streak, and that's the best he could do. And one of the members of the church was a policeman. He said, Dr. Patton, we can put him in jail. Said public profanity like this is against the law in College Station. And I said, well, I think the students need to see this. I think he's doing a pretty good job of showing the kind of argument that the best they can do. I think you just let him do it. But then Texas A&M at Commerce, I was invited to speak there to the physics department. Now, I'm not a physicist. I thought, well, I think I'm going to tell the physicist about these footprints. I'd rather talk about things I know more about than the people in the audience. And I got through, the head of the department stood up, and there were about 30 or 40 professors that were there, and some grad students. And I can't quote it verbatim, but I can come very close to what he said. Now, he had to go to another meeting, and he apologized. He said, I'd like to stay and discuss this, but he says, I find this absolutely compelling, logically compelling, and unanswerable, and left. So, A&M at Commerce, it was very different. You might speculate about why, but there's a wide variety of responses. We answered questions for the next couple of hours with the rest of them, and it was very good questions and really good discussion. Yes.
How many other instances of evidence is being destroyed are you aware of? How large of a problem has that presented itself?
It's a big problem. It's hard to imagine, but we've run into it at least half a dozen times where they've destroyed the evidence. There at the debate that I mentioned at LSU, where the fellow didn't show, I had some bones from the Malachite man, which you don't see here now because somebody ran off with them at that debate. So I don't have those green bones anymore. And well, people react different ways. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, they wanted to kill Lazarus. That's a pretty stubborn, irrational response. Others were impressed and believed. And we're looking for the honest hearts that'll follow the truth and know that there are going to be some that don't like it. And our Lord found that out. Good questions. Who else would have them? Yes.
When you consider the nature of the carvings that you look at and everything, I guess the argument from the other side would be that it's all from the imagination, if there's no possible way they live together. When considering like the whole body of the carvings, is normally what you see what you would expect them to observe around them? Or do they have other like fantastical things that are unbelievable and, other than the dinosaurs?
There's some, in the Mexican ceramics, there's some bizarre things. But there's some that are just, they're a better rendition than what you see right up here. I mean, it's just perfect. And then everything in between. So there's some good artists and some not so good artists. And some, now, the question is, what were these ceramic figurines for? And we found figurines somewhat similar in Babylon that were buried under the threshold, but they were the gods that they were worshiping. And some of them were calves and some of the fantastic figures that you see in the apocalyptic descriptions. But many of them really, but if you're going to make a picture of a god or pick out something you're going to worship, I think a dinosaur is better than a calf. That'd make a better god. But you're going to ward off evil spirits by putting the gods at your threshold, which is what that was for. Apoplectic, I think, is the fancy word, to ward off the spirits with the gods. I think dinosaurs do a good job of that. Warding off spirits as good as anything. But that seems to be the purpose. They were found in caches, buried together, maybe 10 and 12 at a time. So maybe there was a house on top of it originally, and not buried that deep. So trying to imagine a Stegosaurus and doing it perfectly, that's pretty hard to imagine. I had one professor at Price Museum of Natural History, Price, Utah, and I was showing him some of the petroglyphs of the dinosaurs. And he said, yeah, I've seen this in several places. I said, well, how did the Indians draw pictures of them if they've been gone 65 million years? And it was almost like he hadn't thought that thought before. It just, he said, well, they smoked that Paiute, that crazy stuff. I said, you mean they had a 65 million year old dream? And he was embarrassed, and he had no answers. But that's the kind of experience I've had. Dinosaurs with human feet and aliens and Indians smoking Paiute. Yes, sir.
Do you have a thought on what happened to the larger dinosaurs?
What happened to the larger ones? I think the world after the flood was not that well suited. I think they survived, and we see indications that people were seeing them in Europe and all around. But they have to have a lot to eat, and I don't think the world was as plush and as productive. I don't think there were deserts and ice caps on the high mountains, Arctic areas that are barren today. I think and the fossil record indicates it was all tropical, subtropical across. So there was much more for them to eat. One of the problems in anatomy and physiology is trying to pump blood 80 feet in the air. If you look at a giraffe's heart, it's huge, and it only goes 20 feet. And some of them wrestling with that problem have suggested that maybe Apatosaurus had at least 8 hearts in order to relay the pressure, which of course is not indicated anywhere in what we see in the fossils. But if you have twice the atmospheric pressure produced from the waters that were above the firmament that collapsed in 40 days and 40 nights, then you'd have half the atmospheric pressure. It'd be a whole lot harder to pump the blood up now with half the atmospheric pressure. It's kind of like lifting things in the bottom of a swimming pool. It's a lot easier. And with twice the atmospheric pressure, that would not be a problem. So harder for them to grow that big. Some of the proposed eyewitness accounts, some people say, what happened to them? And I reluctantly say, I'm not sure they're all gone. We've got some very interesting eyewitness accounts of evolutionists and those who had no real axe to grind. Roy Mackal is a zoologist, University of Illinois, who's written a couple of books about Mekele Mbembe from the Congo. And they're about 40 to 50 feet long. And the natives know, you say Mekele Mbembe, he'll draw you the Apatosaurus or Brontosaurus type. Or if you say, or if you show him a picture of Apatosaurus, he'll say Mekele Mbembe. And he's seen them twice, he says, and has a recording. The film ate his, the swamp ate his film, so, and the boat turned over. But anyway, he's not a creationist, he's an evolutionist. But in Papua New Guinea, there's a lot of accounts of seeing the flying pterosaurs. I cannot tell you that's been documented, but I expect it to be documented soon, from what I've seen. They're seeing them each evening. They're nocturnal, they're hard to photograph, but we've got some working on it. Oh, who else has a question? Yes, sir. I don't tell people I believe they're still alive. I strongly suspect it. That's as strong as I can make it. We have not proved that, and we need to do it. Yes.
So do you think for the smaller ones that they're most likely just hunted down to extinction, kind of like the bison, where, if they're back in the 15th century, but then maybe, not mass?
What was Sir George doing? And if they were around here and you didn't have PETA or environmentalists, you get rid of them. You wouldn't want them with your kids playing out in the backyard, running around. And it's what happened to the lions in Israel. They're gone. So that, of course, is not an uphill process. That's degenerative, downhill. That's opposite of evolution. Other questions? All right, we appreciate your interest tonight. We're glad that you're here. I think we have exciting evidence, and really this is the tip of the iceberg. It's a struggle to me to, if you're familiar with Keynote or PowerPoint, you can hide the slides. You don't have to show them all. I've got more hidden than I'm showing. which will give you a clue. Thank you, Ed. Tomorrow night, we're talking about the fossil record. If I've got one shot on the college campus just to present the idea, this is when I go with the one tonight, the footprints and that kind of evidence. But if I debate where I have to fully document each point, I want to go with the fossil record. And many people are intimidated, think this belongs to the evolutionists, and that is not true. They belong to us, and I think we can defend it, and I look forward to telling you about that tomorrow night.